we here? And who am I? Let's start there. Does that sound good? I'm a little nervous right now. Like, I don't know if anybody's ever walked into the wrong bathroom, but that's sort of how I feel right now. So today we're talking about the personal and professional ramifications of mullets. Just kidding. Today we'll talk about slotting patterns in React. They're slightly different in React. The pattern is the same as it is in other frameworks like Vue or Angular. And I'm Reggie Brown. So I work at a company here in town. I lead a software team. My team is here and some other people. And I see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones too. So some of you know me and some of you don't. If you have questions at some point or you feel like heckling me, just blurt it out. Let's have some dialogue around this. So we're going to talk about JavaScript and React and implementing a slotting pattern. So let's do it. So a quick overview of what I want to talk about today is what is a slotting pattern? Let's review composing components in React. Let's do some examples, like let's look at some actual code and see what this looks like. And then let's also have some discussion. And I think we'll also do a quick refactor of a component and take a look at it and see what that looks like. So what is a slotting pattern? So this pattern exists in several different frameworks. And the idea is to create a generic component that has open slots, or React in their documentation refers to them as boxes. And they accept any JSX passed as a prop. So it's basically components that don't have a strict parent-child relationship. I've been trying to think about this. I'm about to move, and so I've been trying to think about ways to draw analogies between what's going on in my life and make it relatable to development. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that different rooms in a house are these generic boxes. You can put a couch in them, or you can put a love seat, or you can put infinite number of lamps, whatever tickles your fancy. And that's sort of how I've been conceptualizing this. And I think that as we get into it, you'll realize that the slotting pattern is not entirely dissimilar to the way that you're used to passing around props. So let's go over some of the basics. I don't know how many people have React experience and people who don't, but generally React relies really heavily on a compositional model, and they really recommend avoiding inheritance. So the slotting pattern will work with composition, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. So some of the basics that you'll need to know are, what are props? And props are the creation parameters that help define a component. Components can accept arbitrary props. They can be primitive values, they can be React elements, and they can be functions. It can accept any of these. You'll also need to know what JSX is, and JSX is a syntactic extension of JavaScript that produces React elements. And we'll take a look at what that looks like in a minute. And then you also need to understand what children are. And children are props that are passed to a component inside of its JSX tag. And there's a couple different ways to do that. You can nest it, or you can pass it directly or explicitly as a prop. So how do props and JSX work together? We have two examples, one here for props and another one down here for what JSX is. So React elements are JSX, they're objects, and they can be passed as props. Components can have one, none, or an infinite number of children. And you can pass JSX into any prop, not just React's children prop. So the other way to do that is by nesting the JSX within the component tags. Does anybody have questions at this point over the basics? No? Cool. So how and why would we create slots? So going back to the analogy I had a minute ago, thinking about putting things within a house, you might have a template page. Maybe you have a documentation site and you have many different pages that have different content on them, and they're related to different topics. And the idea would be that you can pass any children that you want to those components, and you can make them extensible, and you can make your components reusable. So React components don't always know what their children look like, and we're going to build on that a little So the way that you do this, or the how, is to use props.children, or you can define your own convention that uses whatever you want, any prop that you want to define. So some things that I was trying to keep in mind when I was thinking about this is a colleague was the one who suggested this to me, and I was trying to think about some issues that would go into implementing this. So some of them might be things like resolving or adding to technical debt. Will this help reduce markup or the boilerplate that goes into creating new pages? Can you improve readability of the code? And I want to dive into that one in a little bit. And can you create an extensible component with this pattern? Then I was trying to think about technical debt, like what, when, where, and why. Do you want to do this early on? Does it make sense to come back and refactor your entire code base? Does it make sense to do things just moving forward and implement every new page or new component that you add to add the slotting pattern? So what I found when I did this was that planning ahead helped. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like. So I have, there we go. Ignore the error warnings. So this is a template that's using a standard div soup, is what I'm calling it. Div soup, I think, is a pretty well understood thing in React. So this is a template, and I'll show you what it looks like in code. So, sorry, 1 second. Cool. So this is a template with no slots into it. And as you can see, like, it's all very explicit, and we have div soup. And the issue with this is that if you have a bunch of different pages and you want to go in through and change them, you have to go through and you have to edit all of the class names, you have to edit everything. And so it's not very reusable. And like the slotting pattern makes it so that you can reuse some of this stuff, and we'll take a look at that. But for a second, let's talk about what children actually look like in React. So here we have a button prop that accepts props.children, and this is pretty boilerplate. But the children prop isn't different from any other prop in React. So you can do it one of two ways. You can pass it explicitly by saying that it's children, or you can do it by just nesting the JSX within the component tags. So either way is perfectly valid, and the two are absolutely equivalent. Yeah. So let's look at using, so I did not take the time to do React Router or something like that, but this works pretty well. So this is a template that's using props.children, and as you can see, they look the same. The Letterkenny quotes are even identical. They're not on all of them though, so if you like Letterkenny, enjoy. Does somebody like Letterkenny? Yeah, it's good. So let's look at the template props with children and look at what the difference between the two is. So here, unlike the other one I have open, so here, the first example, this is all just hard-coded. Whereas in the second example that I just put up there, and they look exactly identical, we're passing the props as children. And the way that those props are getting put in is, I have a content, and so this is not, in terms of like a layer of abstraction, I don't know that this is super helpful. But this is just the first example to illustrate the difference between passing them as props and having them within the same component. So the next thing to move on to would be to use a template. We're going to do the same thing, but instead of passing it explicitly with children like I showed you a minute ago in the button component example, this time we'll just pass it as JSX, and you can see that they are identical. they're even the same color, but the quotes are different. These buttons don't do anything, but they might later. So then the next way to do this would be to implement a slotting pattern. So again, like slotting is a way to build boxes within your components that you can template so that they can be used as they're needed. So if we look at this example, it's kind of hard to.
Can you scroll up just a bit?
Yeah. I want. Boom. Okay, so this one looks a lot different than the other examples we've had, right? So in the previous example, we just have the single props.children. And in the new one, we're explicitly setting the props. So right here, I'm not doing anything crazy with styling. I'm just giving this as an example to show that this template can accept props, and then we can slot components into each one of the we can slot components into these props as we need them. So you don't have to include all of these. So for example, you can see what it looks like right now with this template using slots, the bottom yellow one. Can't really scroll up anymore though. But we can also take out any of these. And the layout will update accordingly. So you could add styling around this to make things a little bit more dynamic, and you could do some other stuff too. But slots allow you to put things where you need them and use them. Okay, so I don't know how to get back to here we go. Okay, so a couple things to keep in mind for a minute are that at the level that you pass children, or you pass a child prop into a component, you're now at the parent scope. So if you use composition, there's a caveat here where if you're defining each component explicitly, you would have to pass props from one component to another, whereas if you use a slotting pattern, you can simply slot a component into a parent component and pass, for example, a user object. So let's say that you have your entire app page, and then you want to put a nav bar in there, and maybe some of the items on the nav bar will change based on the context of what user's looking at it. Maybe it's the difference between an admin and a non-admin. So when you slot a nav bar into your app component, you can pass that user context down, as opposed to having to declare a nav bar, a menu item, and passing explicitly the prop of user from component to component. So yeah, it will passing children directly to avoid requiring each component to manually pass props, which it can also allow you to get around some of the need for context or Redux or other state management. And we can look at this a little bit more in just a second. So if we go back and we think about some of the things that I was trying to keep in mind with whether or not this was worth implementing, let's do a little bit of live coding in just a moment. But let's review these one more time. So does it help us reduce markup or boilerplate? Does it make the code more readable? And I'm not really sold on this. I'm not sure that it makes it more readable, though it does fall more in line with the way that you pass props with React. So it really just kind of depends on, we'll figure that out. Okay. Does anybody have any questions yet? No? Cool. So what I would like to do is look at this component. So right now we have a basic component, and it does not use the slotting pattern at all. This is the div soup that I was talking about originally, and I would like to refactor this really quickly, or hopefully moderately quickly, somewhere along those lines, and then we can look at the git diff and see what this level of effort looks like. So some of the other things that I've been trying to keep in mind is like, what are the concerns for your team? Does this create extra overhead or extra work, and is it worth it? Or is there a business value to doing this? And we can go into a discussion about those things in just a minute. So would anybody like to point me in the right direction to start this refactor? So we can look at another example. Like this is the template with slots. So we probably want to make these things fairly similar, if not identical. So, yeah, I think we're good.
Let's just start from the top.
What?
Let's just start from the top. The big text.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so if we're gonna pull some of these things out, we should start by declaring them. So let's start with big text, which for some reason the other one is called small text. It's kind of hard to type with one thing.
Reggie, you want me to hold your mic?
Sure.
Byron.
Byron's got it.
There we
Thank you,
go.
Byron. Everybody, this is Byron. He's really nice. Okay, let's pull this out. So we can do this pretty simply. We can just literally copy and paste it, and it will be just fine. But then we're going to need to account for the prop here, right? So let's include props, because we're going to need to pass them down. Then we are going to need to account for it here. So props dot big text. So we're probably going to need to break out the rest of them just the same. So now we're about to get to using state and a functional component. And I have not actually thought about this, full disclosure. Let's put in each one. So now we're going to also need the button.
You could put the button and the div and its state as its own component, since it's all tied together.
Okay, so instead of, are you saying doing it as a function? Like this?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So we'll need to take use state out of here. And then, like this? Is this what you had in mind?
And then also the div underneath,
Okay,
because it doesn't make sense without that button.
agreed.
Sounds like you're cheating.
Okay. So then we'll also do and now we'll want to take this and do main content. Thank you.
Reggie,
You're doing really well.
don't forget your return and button slot.
Return where?
In button slot,
Mm-hmm.
And you'll want to wrap,
Oh, right.
Yeah.
either wrap it or
one line lower though.
You are correct.
you either wrap it or put a fragment on it.
Put a fragment?
Because you can't have
Yeah, you've got to
future
return
words.
one.
Yeah. So wrap these in a div or put a fragment?
You just do it with
Open,
fragments.
close.
Say what?
You can just do open and close angle bracket, so you then do the same thing on the bottom end with your backslash.
Yeah, you don't need the word fragment.
Fragments are not necessary.
Okay. Like this?
That's short.
Yeah.
Yep.
I learned something new today.
Woo!
You can go home now.
Fragments are awesome.
Yeah. I've never done it without using the word. Okay. So, oh, we're gonna also need main content, right? So then we're also going to need to, wait, does anybody have an idea of what else we need to do? Well, let's like actually build this, right? So right now what we've done so far, thanks, I'll give it back to you in a second. So now we have our component that accepts all the props that we want and we'll slot them into the appropriate places. And then the next step that we'll have to do is to actually build out the component and pass the props to it and then export that, and then we can pull it into our main app and see what that looks like. Thanks. What should we call this? Anybody?
Refactored with slots.
Not Big E. I'm going with Big E, but I appreciate your input. Yeah. So let's call this refactor to slots, and let's pass these things in. Let's also open.
Is Travis going with?
Yes.
Okay. Is he with me or you? I don't want you. Okay.
Cool. So it's gonna complain about this as well. Let's do. This is not liking me right now though, because of this. Cool. So now we will want to pass in these props, right? And we can do this.
Take out
Yep.
the caret at 52.
Sorry, take out which one?
The right caret.
This one?
Yeah, if you're passing in the prop.
Cool. So big text is going to equal. Did I assume I called it big text, right? I did. Cool.
Parentheses instead of braces.
Sorry, where?
50 and 58. Instead of open close brace, open close paren.
Unless you return.
Or you could return.
Well, I'll have
or
to
you can
return it,
return.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this. Doesn't look quite right, but. Okay.
You have two default exports in that file. So
Line 48.
It's just gonna complain about it for linting, but it should still work, right?
You can only have one default export per file, but you can just comment line 48 and it'll work.
Alright. I thought that was just a linting rule, but it'll actually prevent it from working. I believe you. Yeah. Oops. Uh-oh. So this is the part that I did not think about before. It's the error that we're getting is that useState is called in a function button slot, which is neither a React function component or a custom React hook function.
So in my head, I thought this state would have still been at like kind of.
Oh, it's just a casing issue. It needs to be uppercase because it's a React component.
For button slot, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Corey.
And actually, I think it needs to also be rendered as a.
We don't. It have to be called executed.
And
It-
then wrap it
be good.
No, that should be fine.
That's fine.
That's just, yeah, the slot for it. Yes! It refactored. Cool, thank you, Myra. I really appreciate everyone's help.
Click the button.
Thank you. Oh, you wanna click the button?
Yeah.
It works in both places.
Nice.
Okay, so let's take a look and see what the git diff looks like. Because this was one of my biggest concerns about implementing this with existing components. It's kind of hard to see all of that. So it might be difficult to read the text, but you can see just the large diff between the two, right? So if you're wanting to implement, this is one of my concerns with it. Like we have, at work where I was thinking about doing this, we have a really large code base and a lot of components and examples, and you could iterate over a lot of it and maybe simplify it a little bit, but I think that, to me, it seems like a big hurdle to go back and change all of this for existing pages. But one of the other benefits that I can see to it is that if you implement this pattern and then you bring new people onto your team, or you want to just do new development in the future, you have a really well defined pattern. And it's very similar to every other component you ever use. So for example, with like the button component that I'm pulling in from React Bootstrap, in documentation for React Bootstrap, you can look at the props that the button component will accept, and you could document all of this really well within your own app, and then other developers who come along, or even 6 months down the road when you forget what components or what props that you wanted to accept in a component, you can go back and look at the documentation, and it's as simple as passing a prop to that component. And I see that as a pretty big win. So maybe the bigger question for me is like, when is it worth going back and refactoring existing code? And I feel like that's probably up to someone's Scrum Master.
Maybe you could just search your code base for files that have a large count of lines of code, and just, okay, I'll start with a couple big, huge code bases, and then huge blocks of code, and just split those up and see how it feels after that. Does that make sense? So if you have like 100 lines, like maybe that would be better as, 5, 20 line blocks.
I see what you're saying. Like, make sure the effort is worthwhile.
Yeah.
Do it to a big component.
Yeah.
But then, so another thing, and I don't know how I feel about this. So when I think that using this pattern is really similar to the way that other components that we're used to consuming look, I'm not sure which one is actually more readable. So if I look at like a template slots, or let's look at app.js. So I'm bringing in like a template, and then I have all of my definitions down here for variables. I'm not entirely sure if that's more or less readable. Does anybody else have an opinion? Yeah?
Yeah, so this does cause a lot of interaction.
Yeah.
And it seems like I thought the purpose originally was because you could order them in any way that you wanted. Kind of
Right.
like with a modal, you could have a header, not have a header, you could put the body in there and put whatever you need in it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand like what would be the benefit of doing something like this?
Sure. So I'll go back to the example I used just a minute ago. Let's say that you have a dynamic layout that varies depending on your user context. So you have, let's say you're building an app and there are admins or like managers for a retail store, and then there are other people who work there who don't have the same permissions, so maybe they don't get the same menus. So if you have like a nav layout, like you're saying, you could vary this and only slot in the components that are applicable to that user. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying instead of passing a separate navigation prop that is either there or not there to show it or hide it, you're saying you would just not put it in as children.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then you could pass props within there that are dependent on that, I don't know, user ID, and have it only slot in the parts to that component that you want. So you could break out the nav bar, and then you could pass in admin panel versus sales rep panel or something like that. Does that answer? Yeah, Joe.
So do you have a favorite way of passing props from the wrapper into one of the slots? And do you like to use functions or context or something else?
So I can show you what that looks like. Actually, I don't have an example of it, but I can type it really quickly. I think I can do like this. Not doing it. This thing's heavy.
Next thing.
Yeah. Next time I'll wear a headband so I can do it like this. Thank you, Byron. So if you have, like I think this is what you're saying, where you want like this. So here you would have,
Can you increase the font size?
But like,
Yep.
like if you left the use state in the wrapper instead of putting it in the button component, how would you pass those props in?
how would I pass like the count from here to
Yeah.
the other component?
Now, what if main camp content needed the state as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. So this is the concern that I was talking about a minute ago, and I'm not sure how to get it back up. So if I think about this for a second, I suppose you could pass it as another prop that would go back up. I don't know, Joe, I haven't thought about this.
I know there's a couple of ways. I haven't found one that I fully like.
Yeah, like
So I'm
using,
just curious. Well, for example, you can make button slot. You can pass. You can make that button slot a function,
here,
and then pass the prop in.
yeah.
Or you could have the context and then have the consumer inside of it. But then it has to know that there's a consumer. So
Yeah, then you end up like really tightly coupling them.
yeah, so that's what I'm trying to figure out. I
Yeah.
haven't seen a solution that I really like. Just curious. Or Redux, there you go too.
Yeah, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
I just want to make a statement. It seems to
Cool.
me like you're kind of slotting is good for like templating.
Yeah.
Is what I'm getting, and I feel like with templates you're more just trying to keep it dumb, where you just want to put some content or something where you're going to display. If you have more interactions, it seems like this might be a difficult approach, like for all the reasons Joe just said, or moving state up or down, or
Yeah, I feel like it would be easiest if you can like really isolate concerns per component.
yeah.
Yeah. It works really well for templates. So like another example that I've been thinking of is if you wanted to implement something like performance measuring or tracking different components, it would be pretty easy to, let's say that you have a table and you have buttons. You could slot those buttons into different props, like let's say you could call one prop like count clicks, you could call another prop time visited or time on page, something like that. So you could slot whatever components you want into the tracking component, and you could pretty easily explicitly decide which components get which measurements. But that doesn't really do much that doesn't address the concern that you're talking about where like you have really complex components. I'm thinking most of the use cases that I can think of that are big wins are for templates.
I mean, I think it would also help with like testing if you're, wanting to decompose it. I think it helps with abstraction. So
Yeah.
Just making it smaller. I mean, it's a trade-off between maybe readability, but
Yeah.
confidence in knowing that things are easier to test and.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That's all.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. Okay. Anybody else?
One
Yeah.
more comment. I think to expand on the templating thought, the readability comes into a lot more play when you think about how much CSS and how much markup is required to create those individual slots.
Mm-hmm.
The content itself is not too bad, but as you go to reuse these templates and these like slot components throughout your code base, you just save on each like that multiplier of the number of times you use it. And so I think when you bring in sort of more complex CSS situations, I think sliding is like a big win.
I think so too, and I think it also depends on the size of your code base. So I mean, if you have an app that only has 3 pages, it's probably not worth all of this abstraction at all. But for really large code bases, especially if you're going to have multiple teams that are working on the same app, it makes a lot of sense to me.
This type of pattern for me is really about like implementing a design system, right?
Yeah.
So the design system is, this is what my cars look like, this is what my modals look like, I can have these layouts. You can add in conditional rendering on props based on whether they're passed in as pops from the parent calling it. And the parent can still control with the actual content itself. It looks like, functions, how it functions, what it's styled as, but have some default settings that are opinionated for your design that can be overridden by the parent.
Yeah, this
on
is
there
like
for
the
consistency.
Yeah, I think it's as much about like app architecture as it is about following a pattern, right? Like choosing to implement something this big is definitely part of the architecture of your app. So like a quick review, and then I think I'm being cut off. Do components care what their children look like? Definitely not. You can pass primitives, you can pass JSX, you can pass anything you want into a prop. And like what can you use? You can use like React's built-in props.children, which we talked about, like doing it explicitly or nesting it, or you can define props like we just did when we refactored that component. Business value. Thinking about like development speed, whether or not you set this up in the beginning, if it makes it easier for the rest of your teammates to implement stuff because it follows patterns that other components that we're used to consuming use. It reduces the chance of forgetting boilerplate markup, which is like one of the concerns that originally brought this to my attention. And it might help with onboarding new team members. And then I really like this idea of tracking components, but I didn't have time to set up an example that would demonstrate that. So I think I thought this picture was pretty funny because this guy clearly doesn't need a team, he has 4 monitors. It's like, is the investment worth it? I think you have to make that decision on a case-by-case basis. Same with like code readability, I think it makes a lot of sense and it's in line with other patterns. And does the size of your team matter? I really think it does. It's not that difficult to implement unless you're getting into like really complex use cases more than just slotting components in and being able to isolate their concerns. That's it. Thank you all.